Hey everyone, how's it going? So I'm making another response video, but this time it's not towards an article. In fact, it's towards another YouTuber, and I think I talked about him last week, but it's Alpha Investments. And he released a video yesterday titled, "The Reserve List Should Be Expanded, Not Removed in Magic the Gathering." And this totally caught my attention, as it did probably most of his other subscribers. And judging by his like to dislike ratio, he's got 1,000 likes and 778 dislikes. The numbers aren't exact, but it looks like he's got more thumbs up than thumbs down. I mean, obviously this subject is going to be controversial regardless of what you have to say about it, but it seems like people were not too happy about what he had to say, and I wasn't really either. I mean, I watched a video. This is the third time I just watched the video because I wanted to go over his points, and I wrote them down here on my computer, and I'm going to be going over them with you, and I'm going to be responding to his points and sharing why it is that I disagree so staunchly against his ideas. So his first point is saying that if the reserve list is completely redacted, that it would kill the consumer's confidence, and I don't really think that's the case. I think it would kill the confidence of those very select few people who go out of their way to invest a lot of money into these cards. But for the other 98%, 99% of Magic players, I think if you were to add cards to the reserve list, it would kill their confidence that way. If the average Magic player saw that a new post was made that the reserve list was just completely gone, and that new cards were going to be reprinted, or Black Lotus or whatever is going to be reprinted eventually in the future, that wouldn't necessarily kill the value of those older cards. If anything, it would probably increase the value of those older cards because people will want those Alpha, Beta, Unlimited Lotuses or anything like that. And I think just people like me and other average Joe Schmoes, I don't think we'd really be too concerned about whether or not the cards were released from the reserve list. If anything, there would probably be more people interested knowing that they could get the cards that other people have wanted for so long yet never really got. And he says that if this reserve list were to be redacted, that it would just straight up kill WotC's credibility. And I think WotC's credibility has already been killed thanks to bad set design, bad card quality, too many bannings that happened way too soon just because of it was due to being poor set design, and just too many expansions coming out all at once. That's what's killed everybody's credibility with Wizards of the Coast, or it's killed Wizards of the Coast credibility, excuse me. So to surmise that Wizards of the Coast still has credibility at all is funny, to say the least. So one of his biggest points that he was talking about was that there's already investors that are rooted in collecting these reserve list cards. I mean, obviously there's been a non-zero amount of them that have been collecting that since pretty much the inception of the game, and how there are new people entering this market, and how there have been new people entering this market. But he was bringing up that there's big dogs entering the field, and they're buying lots of cards all at once in big, like giant six-figure numbers. And that's the risk that you take when you collect anything that has a finite amount, especially when you know that it's finite because it's reserved list cards. So the prospect of new blood shouldn't mean that the bounty itself needs to expand in order to compensate. To say that we need more cards added to the reserve list to compensate for the new blood entering the fray, this is a really bad allegory, but that's kind of like saying we need new people born so that way the new murderers that are bred throughout their lives have people to kill. That's a far cry, I understand. Like, let's say we need new pet rocks for lonely kids who don't have pets. Like, you see where I'm coming from? Just because there are a non-zero amount of people entering the fray trying to collect a whole bunch of cards that are already highly sought after, that doesn't mean that we need to satiate that thirst and that hunger, because again, this is an element, or this is something that people have been dealing with for at least 25 years, and to automatically add more to it sets a really strange precedent, not just for the reserve list itself, but for also Wizards of the Coast in general. These are the inherent issues with the reserve list. There's going to be such a small subset of product available to such a high demand, and there's ultimately no realistic way in order to compensate for that. Obviously people have already talked about endlessly about how there's so many different legal ramifications for Wizards of the Coast if they were to get rid of the reserve list. All of this commotion and everything about these cards is directly a result of the inherent issues with reserve list cards, and how there's always just going to be a small amount of product for just such a high demand. So he equates this issue to being a funnel, essentially. Let's say the bottom of the funnel is the reserve list cards, and the walls to the funnel are, I don't know, the prices or the supply of the cards themselves. And then everyone trying to get in is the masses trying to get into the funnel, where the issue with that is if you try to expand that funnel or flatten it out or widen it the opposite direction by introducing new cards, like let's say, for example, the Phyrexian mana cards. If you bring in these new cards, it's not going to quell that demand at all. If anything, more cards just does not equal satiation for that demand or the original demand for the reserve list cards themselves. Just because a Gitaxian probe was added to the reserve list does not kill the demand for a Mox Diamond at all. Again, more cards do not equal satiation for that demand. If anything, that demand multiplies by the amount of cards added to that list. You got to think about it this way. If you add Gitaxian Probe, for example, again, into the list of reserve cards, you haven't improved the problem of the reserve list at all. If anything, you've created a bigger demand for Gitaxian Probe by an exponential amount. And because of that new demand, that doesn't necessarily mean that the funnel has been widened or that the demand has been widened, essentially. If anything, that new demand, let's say people buy all of the Gitaxian probes, again, for example, that's not going to solve the problem of buying Mox Diamonds, again, for example. If anything, it's just going to put us back in the exact same problem that we are in. If nobody can get Gitaxian probes or fucking, I don't know, Gut Shot or any other Phyrexian mana card, if there's no way to get any more of those cards, what's the issue? Or what's the solution to this problem? Should we just add more cards to the reserve list so that way more people can get hyped up about that and buy those cards out? So that way we can add more cards to this list so that way those can get bought out, and on and on and on and on, and just, it's a bit maddening if you think about it. It's funny talking about this funnel idea because, you know, it does make perfect sense, but eventually it's going to hit critical mass. And the market for reserve list cards will probably just crash, in my opinion. Either the cards will be too expensive, and as a result, there's no demand because they're so expensive, or proxies for those cards will be of such high quality that they will cause the bubble to burst themselves. And he says that this funnel exists because of WotC's aggressive reprinting. This makes total sense, but it burns those who are invested in more modern sets, like your Mirrodins and your Scars of Mirrodins and whatever. You know, Wizards of the Coast is pulling a Konami like Yu-Gi-Oh, and they're just reprinting cards like crazy. We're going to have what, 2 master sets this year: Explorers of Ixalan, Commander 2017, Conspiracy was last year. The point is they've been reprinting stuff like crazy. While it does kill the confidence of those players, that was kind of the risk that they took. To be honest, you know, when you buy into these newer modern cards, there was no guarantee of those cards being on the reserve list. The reserve list has already existed prior to that point, so anyone who invested in a bunch of polluted deltas before Khans of Tarkir was released, you know, it sucks for you that your investment pretty much just not necessarily shot out the window, but that's a risk that those types of investors take, and it may be a bit more dramatic now just because Wizards has been much more dramatic in terms of them reprinting stuff, but that's just how the game goes. When you invest so much time and money into specific products like cards, it behooves you to vigilantly watch the prices of those cards and to pay attention to the market. There are plenty of resources out there for investors to keep a close eye on how the cards are moving, and it's no fault of ours and it's no fault of Wizards of the Coast if they don't get out from under their cards underneath in time. And they're collecting collectible items that aren't guaranteed to not be reprinted in any amount whatsoever, and that's their own fault if they're financially hurt from a reprint. Going back to the whole proxy thing, because this is a subject that I've wanted to talk about for quite some time. If you think about it, really, Wizards of the Coast hasn't necessarily taken too many steps to crack down on proxies, you know, unless they actually do, and I just haven't noticed around me or anything. I'd be hard pressed to think that every judge checks the legitimacy of every single reserve list card that's in any given legacy or vintage deck for any event whatsoever. They're not stringent because, well, Wizards of the Coast isn't stringent because this is a theory of mine. They're letting proxies kill the reserve list for them. You know, you got to think about it this way. They are legally bound to not necessarily talk or touch or discuss or just do anything with the reserved list. You know, the last time they did was with Mox Diamond and From the Vault Relics, I believe, and they got a shit ton of backlash from that. And Phyrexia Negator in the dual decks Phyrexia versus the Coalition. So yeah, they've already been burned over this subject before, which is why they haven't necessarily talked about it at all in the 7 years since. So yes, while they're legally bound to pretty much just not even look in the general direction of the reserve list, they've been treating proxies pretty much the same way and how they've been growing exponentially in quality. I mean, earlier in the month or month beforehand, Alpha Investments made another video talking about how good of high quality the proxies are getting and how scary that is for people like him. And they should be, because you got to think about it this way. Those people who are making the proxies, I'm guessing a non-zero amount of them are doing it to spite the reserve list. They don't want, you know, Black Lotus to be a $10,000 card, or that's lowballing it, but they don't want these expensive cards to be exceedingly expensive. I don't think they're totally noble in their intent. They're probably making a killing printing off proxies, but at the same time, I don't think any of them necessarily want us normie players to be barred from such high entry points because of these reserved list cards. And it's my opinion that eventually the quality of proxies will be so high that they will be near exact replicas of Magic cards. Like, let's say they get the blue ink thing down to a T, so they pass the light test, they pass the bend test. Let's say they start making cards from M15 forward with the little hollow foil thing at the bottom, and they make those super legitimate and they make those look real. That will happen. That's not a what if, that's a matter of when, because these people are working day in and day out, and I don't know how many generations of proxies we've been through, but they've been churning through them over the past 5 years, 10 years, and they're only going to keep working harder at this. So to think that, you know, proxies isn't going to be something that is going to be thought of in many Magic the Gathering players' minds, it's a bit ignorant to think otherwise. And I don't think people like Alpha Investments or anyone like him aren't thinking about something like that. I'm sure that's a thought that crosses their mind all the time, but I don't know. I just feel like once we've passed that threshold, WotC will have virtually no reason to ever be concerned about the revised list or the reversed list. Reversed, revised, whatever, reserved list ever again, because you got to think about it this way. If Wizards of the Coast sees that these Chinese proxies or wherever they're from are of such high quality that people can't even tell the difference between a scuffed up Black Lotus and a scuffed up Black Lotus proxy, I mean, why would you ever be concerned about the reserve list again, honestly? I don't know. I feel like I'm rambling a bit at this point, but I'm just trying to make a respectful response to someone that I watch and whose content I enjoy for the most part, except for this last video. Not that I didn't like it, but I felt like that I needed to address some points. So in the end, should the reserve list be changed? No, there's too many touchy elements that make it feasible to do so, but if WotC won't kill the reserve list, proxies definitely will do that for them. Anyways, do you agree, disagree? Let me know down in the comment section down below. If you haven't liked, throw a like my way or dislike, whatever. I don't give a shit. Anyways, I'm Tasty Snackies. You all been wonderful, and I'll catch you on the flip side.